G'day mates, it's Busta here. So, as I'm sure that all of you are well aware by now, the YouTube adpocalypse has hit the wallets of many content creators, and none more so than the horror community here on YouTube. As such, the money I'm now earning from YouTube ad revenue is no longer enough for me to survive on. And while this has been distressing for me and others, this doesn't need to be the end of my channel or horror on YouTube. You can keep YouTube creepy and keep my channel operating by pledging as little as $1 a month on Patreon. It's really simple, guys. All you have to do is go on my Patreon account, which is in the description below, and pledge as much or as little as you wish. And as a way of giving back to you guys, if the show can become fully fan-funded, I will remove all mid-roll ads from all of my YouTube videos. Also, to be completely transparent, currently I'm averaging about $300 to $400 a week on Patreon, which is getting really close to sustainability. I need roughly about $700 to $800 a week to pay all of my bills and look after my family and everything, which means we're about halfway to becoming completely independent from YouTube. So if only 400 more of you gave $1 a month, that would put me in a place where I no longer need to be concerned about what YouTube is doing anymore, which in the current climate would be awesome. So if you have $1 or $2 to spare, please consider making a pledge today. And thank you to all those who have already pledged and who will pledge. Your support right now has kept the lights on for me and my family, and I appreciate all of you very much. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoy the video, and without further ado, let's begin. I live in Perth, Australia, known to a lot of people as the most isolated city in the world. This experience took place about 5 or 6 years ago, and I still can't seem to make any logical sense of it. My dad owned a fairly popular paintball business, located in the hills, roughly an hour from the city. I was 14 at the time, and my dad brought me and 2 friends up to the paintball field for the weekend, as he did fairly often. The paintball field is large, roughly 2 kilometers in length, and 1 kilometer in width. To access the property, you drove into a gravel road from the main road, which leads to the playing area, passing several dirt roads which splintered to other areas of the property. The layout of the property consisted of about 5 soccer field-sized paintball fields, with a main reception and prep area. About 200 meters away was the camping area, which my dad and his employees used when working. The rest of the property was just bush and a nice little stream at the far end. So, on Friday afternoon, myself, Dad, and my 2 mates made our hour-long drive to the paintball field, stopping in the local township for supplies. We got there around 7 PM, unpacked our gear and set up the fire pit. It was the middle of autumn, so it was still moderately warm, but having a fire was always amusing. My dad slept in the caravan, as me and my mates, Kyle and Brett, slept in a tent near the fire. The first night was pretty chill. We talked shit, sat by the fire and just relaxed after an annoying week of school. The next day, we got onto my quad bike and explored the property, while my dad and the other employees hosted a large group for paintball. We spent the whole day driving around the massive property, chilling by the stream and having a great time. It takes about a 10-minute quad ride from the stream to the main area, and roughly 30 to 45 minutes by foot. We swam in the stream and explored around. I should also mention that the stream runs underneath the main road via a tunnel, but it's a pretty long tunnel which connects to a property on the other side. So that evening, after having dinner and mucking around, Kyle, Brett and I decided to visit the stream again at night for the thrill of a nighttime ride. I told my dad and we jumped on my quad and headed down. We got there and I immediately sensed the atmosphere was really different than before. Not just because it was at night, but because it was just incredibly eerie, as if you shouldn't be there or something. As it was the bush, normally you would hear sounds of insects and local wildlife, but tonight it was dead quiet. I told my mates, to which Kyle said, "Nah, don't be a pussy, we've been here heaps of times." He had a point, so we kept going and went to the tunnels under the road. I brought my torch with me and we started mucking around. But when we got closer to the tunnels, I heard this strange echo from the other side. sort of like someone or something had run towards the tunnel. I seemed to be the only one who heard it, so, like a dumbass, I just brushed it off. But when I shone my torch down the tunnel, my heart jumped up my throat as we saw an incredibly tall, thin person peer its head at us on the other side. "What the fuck is that?" Brett yelled as we jumped backwards in fear. As he said this thing let out an incredible scream and started running through the tunnel faster than possible for a human. The tunnel was about 100 meters long, I'd say, and this thing clearly did it in about 5 or 8 seconds. Luckily, the quad bike was nearby and was in idle, so we jumped on and I sped out of there as quick as shit. Kyle and Brett sat on the back watching this thing get closer, seeming to almost match our speed. They screamed at me to go faster, so I shifted gears, but the engine had a fit and started to rev insanely loud. I just knew if I stalled it now, we'd be dead. But then, the sounds from the engine seemed to scare this thing away, as it jumped into the bushes, no less than 50 meters from us. The engine didn't stall, thank God, but before I sped off, I looked back to see where this thing had gone. Kyle and Brett shone the torch behind us, and not far from where we were, we saw this inhuman, tall thing run away, back to where it had come from. Well, I didn't wait any longer, and I sped right back to the main area, cutting across one of the paintball fields as a shortcut. We got back to the campsite, and we ran into the caravan and locked the door. My dad looked at us with confusion as we stood there shaking. I told him what had happened and told him about this thing that chased us, but my dad didn't take it seriously, saying that it was probably just an animal. We never saw that thing for the rest of the weekend, and I refused to go back to the paintball field since then. This experience kind of drove me and my friends apart, as we now no longer talk. My dad recently sold the business, and we've grown distant after he and my mum divorced too. But up to this day, I still can't make any sense of what we saw that day. I can only think of 2 possibilities. One was that it was a weird man, potentially deranged or something. But that doesn't make much sense, as the nearest township was 20 minutes away, so a random man in that bush at that exact place and time is near impossible. There is also no way a human could run that fast and make that kind of noise. The second, impossible but more likely explanation, was that this thing was a skinwalker. I've done a lot of research into them since that night, and I'm fairly convinced that it was probably one of them. But I've never heard of a skinwalker in Australia. Neither have I heard of any similar Aboriginal folklore. But honestly, I don't know what to believe. The whole experience gave me nightmares, and it sends shivers up my spine as I type this. I just hope nobody else encountered that skinwalker when I left, and I am so grateful that we made it back alive. Safe to say, if my quad engine didn't scare it away, my friends and I wouldn't have made it out of there. When I was about 7 years old in 2007, I was very close to being abducted. I remember it vividly, and I'm still terrified of what happened. I live in a 2-story house in a safe neighborhood. My mother and I were the only ones home at the time. My mother was taking a bath upstairs while I watched Nickelodeon downstairs, alone in the living room. The way that my house is set up is that anyone can see in the living room through the front door, even if the door is shut. I remember hearing a knock on the door, and I couldn't ignore it since whoever it was at the door could see me and knew that someone was home. My mum usually would hide in the kitchen until the person knocking went away if she didn't want to see them, but it was too late for me to run into the kitchen since he could see me now. I remember feeling guilty since my mum had always warned me to never open the door to strangers. I got the key and unlocked the door. A man in his early 30s or maybe late 20s, wearing work clothes with a green tie, was at the door. He asked if I knew where my neighbor was and that he needed to see him. I also noticed that the guy was looking around inside of my house while he waited for me to answer. I asked him which neighbor he was talking about, and then he said that he was older and lived somewhere near here. He didn't give me a name, and he was as vague as possible. I felt bad because I didn't know who he was talking about, since I live in a neighborhood with primarily older couples. I told him that I couldn't help him, but then he insisted that I help him search the neighborhood for my neighbor. I declined, but the guy just kept asking me. I told him no once more, and then the guy grabbed my arm and started pulling me out of the house. I grabbed the doorframe and called for my mum. The man let go of my arm and started casually walking back to his car. I'm pretty sure that it was a beige Civic, but I'm not too sure. It honestly scares me the most that he didn't bolt and speed off. He was just too calm. I just stood there and watched him drive away as if nothing bad had happened. I didn't tell my mum about this incident until I was about 15, and she flipped her shit. I regret not telling her sooner because there's no telling what this guy has done after trying to kidnap me. To this day, I still panic when I hear someone knock on the front door. When I was in my early 20s, I shared a 4-bedroom house with some friends. We lived there for just over 4 years, I think. The house had been built in the early 1990s, so it was pretty old, but it had been remodeled over the years. The first thing that ever happened there was within the first few months of me moving in. I was snuggling up with my boyfriend and had the room dark with just a candle of light, when out of nowhere, my boyfriend just started screaming and pointing at the wall. I turned around and there was this shadow. We always described it as a hooded demon with a big knife or something. I mean, it didn't kind of look like a demon. It totally looked like one. We both were screaming and trying to move stuff around to get rid of the shadow, but we couldn't. We finally turned on the light, got dressed, and ran out to tell our roommates. Of course, they wanted to come back into the room to see the shadow, so we all went back in, lit the candle, and turned off the lights. And there was no shadow of any kind. My boyfriend and I would occasionally try to recreate it. We were always pretty sure that my hairbrush was the knife, because the night of the shadow, the hairbrush was poking out of a bag that I had hung up on the side of my shelf. The handle of the hairbrush, though, looked nothing like a knife, and we could never figure out what made the hooded head of this demon. I mean, at the time, we really believed that it wasn't anything paranormal. It was just somehow a weird shadow or something. After that, nothing happened for years, until about the 3-year mark. I was home with one of my roommates. He was up in his room making a tape. This was in the early 90s when we had vinyl and made mixtapes all of the time. I was on the main floor watching TV. When the commercial came on, I ran into the kitchen to put the kettle on for tea. There was no way of pausing back then, so I pretty much was going to put on the kettle, knowing that the water would boil until the commercial was over, and I'd have to miss a bit of my show to make the tea. Except that when I lifted up the kettle to put the water in, the kettle was full of boiling water. I looked at the stove and nothing was on. I put my hands over the burners and everything was cold. I vainly thought that somehow my tea-craving latent psychic abilities had magically boiled the water. My roommate happened to come downstairs as all of this was happening. He'd been up there for at least an hour, and there was no way that he could have snuck downstairs to pull a prank on me. I was kind of in shock as I was telling him the story. I poured the boiling water to make tea, and he stood over by the stove, feeling the burners, trying to figure out how I might have been mistaken. When, suddenly, I heard a crash in my bedroom, which is right beside the kitchen. My roommate and I quickly opened the door. My roommate was certain that it was an intruder. My bedroom window was wide open. This was in the middle of winter in a house that was really old and hard to heat. The window was a tiny one, not big enough for a person to fit through, and was also pretty high up. And there was a framed photograph lying face down on the floor. Its normal place was on a shelf about 4 feet away. In shock, my roommate and I closed the window and spent a few minutes trying to recreate the picture falling over and making it across the room. And there was just no way. At this point, I was for sure thinking ghost or spirit or something, and my roommate was trying in vain to make it not a ghost. We put the picture back and shut the door, and a second later, we heard a crash again. And we opened the door, and the picture was back in the middle of the floor, face down, window still shut. Well, my roommate and I spent the night in the living room. But after that, there was never really anything else. Well, except for one thing. Years after we had all moved out, we got together for some drinks one night, and were talking about our years in that house. I casually mentioned that on rare occasions that I was the only one at home at night, and I always had this horrible fear of leaving my room. I felt like something was in the hallway and that it would be really angry if I came out to use the bathroom or anything. I don't know how to explain it, but it just felt malevolent. My roommates all looked at each other and they said that they had the exact same feeling all of those years, but no one had ever said anything to anyone else because we all thought that we were being stupid. My two roommates had the upstairs bedrooms, but they also felt like something was going up and down the hallway from the kitchen to the front of the house, kind of stalking, waiting for someone to dare to leave their bedrooms. Luckily for us, there was almost always someone home, or at least we all went out together. So, to start with, I'll just tell you a little bit about where I live so you'll understand this experience a bit more. I live in a small terraced house in a town in England. It's an old Victorian house. It's over 100 years old. I've lived here all my life and I'm now 20. Downstairs, there's just the front room with a door that shuts it off, and then a corridor with the kitchen and dining table, and then another door which is like a big brown door with a small glass frame in it so you can clearly see through it. Behind this door, there's the back door which leads out to the house to the left, and then a bathroom straight on and just a small corridor in between. Also, I have a sister who's 4 years older. She's a major part of this story too, as she was there. She's literally the opposite of me. I've always been interested in the paranormal and been creative and interested in the extraordinary. But my sister was always really smart and always thought logically. Even at such a young age, she never believed in anything paranormal. She said it was nonsense and thought I was daft for believing in it. Anyway, it happened quite a while ago now. I was about 7 years old at the time, and my sister was 4, nearly 5 years older than me. She was about 11 or 12. It was a school day, and we would usually go to our grandma's after school, as her house was closer and usually my mum and dad would still be at work by this point. They didn't want to leave me and my sister home alone for long. However, my granddad had recently passed away, and my grandma was having a really hard time. She said that she didn't want me and my sister to see her so sad, so we didn't go to my grandma's that day. My dad left early and picked us up from school and dropped us off at our house. So we were home for a while, then my mum finished work and my dad was heading out to go and pick her up. We only had one car and usually my mum would take it to go to work, and my dad usually car shared. But this day, my dad knew that he was going to finish early and pick us up, so he had the car instead that day. Me and my sister, we were watching a film and didn't want to go to pick up my mum. So after a lot of persuasion, my dad gave in, and after checking the house was thoroughly locked up, he headed out, locking the door behind him. So me and my sister, we were just chilling, watching this film. It was probably something Disney or on the Disney Channel, knowing me. Everything was fine, normal, and nothing was going on. Then my sister went to go and get us a drink, so she headed into the kitchen. In the kitchen, there was a large fire door leading through to the bathroom and back door to the left. She was in the kitchen for only a couple of seconds before she ran back into the front room and slammed the door behind her. She looked terrified. I knew that there was something wrong immediately because it always took a lot to scare her, and something had really obviously shook her up. Then she started shouting at me to hold the door leading to the kitchen, and when I asked her why, she just screamed at me to do it. So I went to the door and held onto the handle like she said. I literally had no idea what was going on at this point. My sister was using the phone in the living room, which was a corded phone then, to try and call my dad to tell him to come home. But obviously he was driving to pick my mum up, so there was no answer. My sister was sobbing uncontrollably, and I was so panicked, but mainly because she hadn't told me what it was that had freaked her out so much. So I asked her again, and she told me that there was a man in the house behind the door. She said that she could see him through the glass. At this point, I was just in shock, and I wasn't sure whether to believe her or not. So, being the curious and stupid child that I was, I opened the living room door and could see straight through the kitchen. The glass panel in the door was at an adult head height, but was only big enough to see the head. But clear as day, I saw a man's head. There was a man stood in the corridor in our house behind the door, just staring at me. It didn't even look like he was blinking. He was just staring and not moving an inch. He was probably middle-aged, with dark hair and eyes, and his skin looked worn. I will never forget his face to this day. And he was just staring at me with an expressionless, unpredictable stare for what seemed like minutes. When I came to my senses, I slammed the door behind me, closing both me and my sister in the front room. I was holding onto the door with all of my might at this point, and I was just so scared. My sister was still crying, and it was really weird as she was never one to cry. She was always the strong one, but there was just something about him, aside from the fact that he could be a murderous burglar, that just didn't feel right. While I was holding onto the door, expecting the man in our house to come through the door and probably murder us at any time, my sister got through to my dad and was on the phone telling him everything. He was on his way back anyway, and as he was almost home, he told us to stay in the living room. He and my mum were literally back in about 5 minutes, probably less. But those few minutes were the most nerve-wracking and terrifying moments of our lives. But the man never did come through the door, and we never even heard a sound. We assumed that he was probably still in the house as we never heard him leave. So when my mum and dad unlocked and then came through the front door, me and my sister frantically told them that the man was still behind the door in the kitchen, and that he could be seen through the glass. Long story short, he wasn't there. There was no sign of him. No sign of any break-in or entering. Nothing. And since we lived in terrace housing and our windows give a view of our neighbours' backyards, my parents asked our neighbours did they see a man leave or enter the back door. And since we lived in terrace housing and our windows give a view of our neighbours' backyards, my parents asked our neighbours if they saw a man leave or enter the back door, which wouldn't have been possible because it was locked anyway, and there was no sign of any forced entry. But they said no, they had not seen or heard anything at all. It was honestly as if he had just disappeared into thin air. And my parents, still to this day, don't believe that we were telling the truth. But I'm telling you, my sister and I clearly saw him. For years after that, my sister never wanted to be left in that house alone. It really affected her, and her opinions on the paranormal certainly changed. She is 25 now and has moved out, but even to this day, if I mention the man behind the glass, she just panics and completely freaks out and refuses to talk about it. She never saw him again, but I am quite certain that I saw him a second time, and that was the last time. Quite a few years later, when I was probably 14, maybe 15, I was home from school early and was alone in the house. My sister was about 18 or 19 at the time and had moved to uni, so didn't live at home anymore. And my mum and dad were out working. I was watching TV and I went to go and get a drink. As I walked through into the kitchen, to the left is the stairs leading upstairs, and then a landing with my room on the right. As I walked past the stairs, I could have sworn that I saw someone at the top of the stairs on the landing looking down. But I just brushed it off and figured that it was just a trick of the eye. Probably about 15 minutes later though, I went up to my room to get my computer. As I entered my room, I glanced out of my window to see what was going on outside. It was still broad daylight, so nothing was hard to make out. And, as clear as day, I saw the same man my sister and I saw behind the glass, sat on my neighbor's roof, literally directly facing my house, and he was just staring through my bedroom window. And as I freaked out and glanced away for a millisecond to see if any of my neighbors had noticed him, he was gone. He just vanished and I never saw him again. Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old and continued working there until I was 20. If you are unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they're a little drive-through espresso stand, usually painted in some neon color, where the employees all wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds kind of strange, and believe me, it is strange. But the money was good, it was fun at the time, and my parents couldn't really afford to pay for college. There isn't any loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they ogle you in your skimpy ensemble. Anyway, it's kind of hard to explain, so maybe just Google it. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 a.m. and ended at 9:30 a.m. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30, I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, take stock, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. The other retailer didn't open until around 10 a.m, and so, when I arrived, the lot was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and another in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally, I worked with one other girl, as the shift would get far too busy for one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day. While I worked, I could see cars approach the stand, and know immediately what drink to prepare. It was all based on my recognizing a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars while they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that, for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system, and call me on the business phone to scream at me for a lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I guess he decided that he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. He was really stingy. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside. Coupled with the tinting sliding windows of the coffee stand and the knowledge that I was completely alone, I felt a little creeped out. Though, not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I was about to feel in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino, heavy on the foam. He worked for the local Boeing plant and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to this sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for the sort of thing that happened to me on this particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as bad as one would expect. They simply needed coffee and no other business was open as early as ours. In fact, many of my early morning customers were married women in soccer mum vans, in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till, 3:50 a.m. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer, dryer, etc. This is the area where my co-workers and myself would get ready, and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor, where customers could see us, uniform was required, meaning lingerie or a bikini, as well as heels. That morning, I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered me and provided more coverage than a typical bikini would at the beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took the stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with soapy water, music playing softly on the stereo. And then I heard it. Over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder, and the music, I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. But then I heard it again. It was 3 taps. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15 a.m. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure that I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with an open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness that morning, I had contemplated turning on the floodlights when I first arrived, but it was strictly forbidden to do so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on, and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there, staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. But then there were 3 taps again. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number. He had an extensive camera system, complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside of the stand. At the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I flipped on the floodlights. I walked over to the window, and I saw the man. His hands were pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi!" he yelled through the glass. "Can I get a coffee?" Sorry, we're not open for another 15 minutes, I replied. "My boss will be mad if I open it too early." Okay, well, I can wait, I guess." The man then walked away from the window and stepped into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time, I felt a false sense of security, lulled into the daily routine of my shift. At 4:30, I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. So, what can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around, frantically. Where the fuck was the usual morning guy, Dave? I silently prayed that another customer would pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." Excuse me?" I said, not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you, and if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want with you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. I am not a nice guy. He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long-serving window shut. I ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly. No answer. I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced by the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought that I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was, rushing to the serving window to tell him what had happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me that I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter, and for some reason, this seemed to put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out of the window to place a $5 bill in my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Whoa," he exclaimed. "You just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make good coffee, but it's not that great." "Huh?" I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I made it a habit of just leaving it outside in between customers as it could get really busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope that appeared to be stuffed to its capacity. My stomach turned as I knew it had to be from the guy in the black Honda. Dave," I said cautiously. "It's from that guy I told you about. I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino, and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves on." Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughing about my paranoia, and proceeded to step outside of his car. He took the envelope out of my tip jar and opened it. "Holy shit," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills, held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew even wider. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked as if it was written in a child's hand. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelled incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There are some things that are too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best as I can recall it. It said, "You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. I will then tie you to the post and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterward, I will untie you and use you in every way possible. You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment." Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you're a stealing, lying whore, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no mistakes, or there will be more punishment to follow. I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note, along with the money for evidence. The female police officer, who appeared to be in charge, nonchalantly told me that I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from customers. I tried to tell her that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape footage. The footage showed a man standing outside of the coffee stand window, just staring inside. Occasionally, it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for a better view. And it also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently, he had been standing outside the window since 3:40 a.m., 10 minutes after my initial arrival. At one point, it showed him going back into his car, only to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost an hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all, scared, because the footage also revealed that the man had his license plates covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided that the man posed a potential threat and that his behavior was not normal. They sent an undercover cop back to the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back to work, not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV while I worked, and the plan was this. If the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked, serving all my regular customers, trying my best to pretend that nothing had happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any of my co-workers or customers that morning, in case they knew the man and warned him of the police involvement. And the man did not return that day, but he did return eventually. Little did I know, that day was only the beginning of a year-long nightmare. I know this reads like a work of fiction, but every single word of it is true, I swear. This is the first time that I'm fully retelling this to anyone other than the police, my former boss, my past co-workers, and my ex-boyfriend. So please, play nice.